Inside German headquarters, the air itself felt different in 1944. Not because the walls had changed, or because the uniforms were different, but because the unspoken rules had shifted. Officers still stood at attention. Salutes were still exchanged. Maps were still unfolded across heavy tables. Yet something invisible now governed every word. Fear. It sat in the room before anyone spoke. It lingered after meetings ended. It followed officers down corridors, into offices, into their thoughts. No one needed to announce it. Everyone understood. At this stage of the war, German officers were no longer asking how to defeat the enemy. That question had quietly faded. Instead, a darker calculation had taken its place. How do I survive this meeting? How do I leave this room without drawing attention? How do I obey orders without becoming responsible for the consequences? These were not weak men. Many were veterans of earlier victories. They had studied strategy, command, logistics. They had once believed that competence mattered. But competence no longer protected you. Inside headquarters, reports arrived daily, sometimes hourly, describing units shattered, supply lines broken, positions lost. The numbers were clear. The situation was obvious. And yet, when these reports were summarized for higher command, something strange happened. Words softened. Warnings blurred. Reality was diluted. Not because officers wanted to lie, but because telling the truth had become dangerous. By 1944, Hitler's relationship with his generals was defined by suspicion. Failure was not interpreted as circumstance or miscalculation, but as disloyalty. Retreat was not strategic withdrawal, it was cowardice. Doubt was not analysis, it was betrayal. So officers learned to adapt. They learned which words triggered anger. They learned which phrases bought time. They learned when silence was safer than accuracy. Fear rewired communication. Meetings that should have been arguments became monologues. Junior officers avoided eye contact. Senior commanders spoke carefully, choosing language that sounded confident even when the facts were catastrophic. Maps showed positions that no longer existed. Everyone in the room knew it. No one said it. This silence was not empty. It was heavy. Every officer understood that the wrong sentence could be fatal, if not immediately, then eventually. Careers had already ended this way. Some men were reassigned. Others were arrested. A few simply vanished from the command structure, their names no longer mentioned. Fear taught lessons quickly. As fear spread, initiative died. In earlier years, German officers were encouraged to act independently when circumstances demanded it. The doctrine rewarded flexibility. Speed mattered. Judgment mattered. Now, initiative was a liability. Acting without explicit orders meant taking responsibility, and responsibility meant exposure. So officers waited. They waited for approval that came too late. They waited for instructions that ignored reality. They waited while opportunities closed and enemies advanced. Waiting felt safer than acting. Inside headquarters, time slowed in a dangerous way. Decisions were delayed not because options were unclear, but because no one wanted to own them. Files moved from desk to desk. Orders were reviewed, rewritten, and passed upward. Everyone hoped someone else would decide. Fear turned leadership into paperwork. The irony was impossible to miss. The German military had once terrified its enemies through decisiveness. Now it terrified its own officers through unpredictability and punishment. No one knew which mistake would be forgiven, and which would end everything. So officers chose the only path that felt survivable. Obedience without interpretation. This is where strategy truly collapsed. Strategy requires adaptation. Adaptation requires honesty. Honesty requires safety. Inside German HQ, safety no longer existed. When orders arrived demanding impossible actions, holding ground without fuel, counterattacking without reserves, defending positions already lost, officers felt the weight of inevitability. They knew what would happen. They knew who would die. But they also knew that questioning the order would not save anyone, least of all themselves. So the orders were transmitted, exactly as written. This was not blind loyalty. It was coerced conformity. And it created a command structure that could no longer learn. Mistakes repeated. Disasters multiplied. Lessons were never absorbed. Because learning requires admitting error, and error was punished. Fear changed how officers thought about morality as well. Earlier in the war, duty had been framed as service to the nation, to the army, to one's men. Now duty was reduced to survival within the system. An officer could save his men and be accused of disobedience, or obey orders and watch them die, while preserving his position. Fear made this choice brutally clear. Inside headquarters, some officers felt the weight of this contradiction constantly. They carried it into sleepless nights, into letters never sent, into conversations that ended abruptly when footsteps approached. They were trapped between what they knew and what they were allowed to say, between reality and obedience. And this tension did not explode. It eroded, slowly, relentlessly, silently. As the war situation worsened, headquarters became more detached from the front. Decisions were made farther away from consequences. Orders traveled downward faster than information traveled upward. Fear created a one-way system. Reality flowed in. Illusion flowed out. Officers learned that survival depended not on accuracy, but on alignment. Alignment with tone. Alignment with expectations. Alignment with fear. Those who mastered this survived longer. Those who didn't disappeared. And so, inside German headquarters, fear did not just replace strategy. It replaced judgment. It replaced responsibility. It replaced truth. And it kept spreading. Fear began to shape not only decisions but perception itself. Inside German headquarters, officers stopped trusting what they saw. A report that looked disastrous might be rewritten 3 times before it reached the top. A request for withdrawal might be framed as a temporary realignment. Words became tools of self-defense. Reality was still there, but it arrived filtered. This distortion created a dangerous illusion that control still existed. In meeting rooms, officers listened carefully not just to what was said, but how it was said. Tone mattered more than facts. Confidence mattered more than accuracy. Optimism, even forced optimism, became a form of armor. No one wanted to be the officer whose report sounded wrong, because sounding wrong could be fatal. The psychological strain was immense. Many officers lived with 2 versions of the war in their minds. One was the war on the ground, chaotic, brutal, increasingly unwinnable. The other was the war inside headquarters, orderly, ideological, detached. Holding both at once required constant mental compromise. And compromise corrodes judgment. As fear deepened, officers began to internalize the system's expectations. They no longer needed to be silenced, they silenced themselves. Thoughts were edited before reaching speech. Doubts were suppressed before becoming questions. This was how fear became efficient. No orders were needed to enforce it. Some officers convinced themselves that obedience was still serving a higher purpose. Others stopped believing altogether but continued anyway. A few hoped the war would end before they were forced to face the consequences of their choices. But time was running out, and everyone knew it. When catastrophic decisions were made, orders that doomed entire formations, the emotional reaction inside headquarters was rarely shock. It was resignation, a quiet understanding that another irreversible step had been taken, and that no one had stopped it. This resignation did not look like despair. It looked like routine. Papers stamped. Phones answered. Orders transmitted. Lives reduced to coordinates and arrows on a map. Fear made the extraordinary feel normal. As Allied pressure increased, headquarters grew more isolated. The distance between decision and outcome widened. Officers discussed operations abstractly, as if distance might soften reality. But reality always returned. In casualty lists, in missing units, in reports that could no longer be disguised. Each return tightened the grip of fear. Officers began to recognize a terrifying pattern. Every time reality contradicted orders, reality paid the price. Never the orders. Never the authority behind them. This realization destroyed trust within the command structure. Officers stopped believing that competence would be recognized. They stopped believing that loyalty would protect them. They stopped believing that truth had value. All that remained was survival. Some officers withdrew emotionally. They performed their duties with mechanical precision, avoiding personal investment. Others became rigid, clinging to procedure as a shield. And a few, very few, felt something else growing inside them. A quiet sense that obedience itself had become immoral. But even this thought was dangerous. Inside German HQ, morality had no safe language. There was no space to say, "This order is wrong." There was no space to say, "This will kill everyone." There was no space to say, "We are losing, and pretending otherwise is killing us." Those sentences had nowhere to land. Fear ensured that the system continued functioning long after it had stopped making sense. That was its most destructive power. Officers knew the war could not be won this way. They could see that strategy had been replaced by stubbornness, and stubbornness by terror. Yet the machine kept moving, grinding forward, consuming men and meaning alike. And inside headquarters, surrounded by maps and silence, they felt the weight of something irreversible unfolding. As the walls closed in, something final settled over German headquarters. A quiet understanding that nothing inside those rooms could change what was coming. Officers no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of endurance, of holding on, of lasting one more week, one more order, one more meeting. Strategy had become an exercise in delay, not direction. Fear had completed its work. The most revealing moment was not when orders failed, but when no one was surprised that they did. When entire units were lost, the reaction inside headquarters was muted. No outrage, no reassessment, only paperwork, only acknowledgement, only the next impossible command moving down the chain. This was not leadership. It was collapse disguised as control. By then, many officers understood the truth they would never voice. The greatest danger was no longer the enemy outside Germany's borders. It was the system they were trapped inside. A system that demanded obedience even when obedience guaranteed destruction. A system that punished honesty and rewarded silence. A system where fear had replaced thinking and loyalty had replaced judgment. In these final months, German headquarters continued to function in form, but not in purpose. Orders were issued to formations that barely existed. Plans were drawn for resources that were gone. Commands were enforced without belief, without logic, without hope. And still they were obeyed. This is how fear wins wars, not for the enemy, but against those who surrender their ability to think. Not with chaos, but with discipline stripped of reason. Not with panic, but with silence. Not with collapse, but with routine. Inside German HQ, officers followed orders they knew would fail, because refusing them felt more dangerous than the consequences. And in that moment, when fear replaced strategy completely, the war was already over. Not on the battlefield, but in the mind.